Antarctica. Isolation with enlightenment. Beauty with the beast. A continent of paradoxes. This is a brief presentation of what I've learned about Antarctica. A brief history. Some 100 million years ago, Antarctica was a tropical oasis of thriving animal and plant life, and it's a huge continent, so it was a very large area of many forms of life. Then 34 million years ago, the continent splits off from the world and moves south. Then 25 million years ago, the carbon dioxide levels fall, the exact opposite of what's happening these days. And because the carbon dioxide levels fall, the Earth starts losing heat, cools off greatly, and of course at the poles it even cools off the most. And it turns out that in Antarctica, this giant oasis of Antarctica, the greatest extinction of all time occurs, larger than the dinosaurs. All life on this giant continent perishes. Some trivia about Antarctica. In the summertime, Antarctica is about 1.5 times the size of the US. But in the wintertime, it doubles in size and it becomes 3 times the size of the US. The Sea of Ice, which is what happens in the winter, the ice freezes out and doubles the size of the continent. And this large, super large area of ice becomes the world's largest continuous habitat. And you might think, ice doesn't seem like it's the best habitat in the world. But it turns out underneath the ice, there's an algae that attaches to the ice and lives there quite happily, attached to the bottom of the ice. And there's so much, this is such a great area, landmass, that this algae is able to produce 25% of the Earth's oxygen. So we all need Antarctica to breathe. What's interesting is the penguins can easily walk on this vast ice because their toes are like little crampons, so they just can go along. Pretty cool little creatures, huh? Some interesting facts about Antarctica. It's the highest continent on the Earth, with an average height of 6,000 feet above sea level. The driest continent on Earth. They say down there in the dry valleys, in the McMurdo Valley, it hasn't seen any precipitation as far as we can figure out for an estimated 2 million years. That's pretty dry. Good place, I guess, if you want sun. Well, maybe not, because I guess half the year it doesn't. Anyway, it's also the coldest continent on the planet, with a negative 140 degree Fahrenheit recorded at the Russian research station at Vostok, and an average yearly temperature across the continent of negative 49 degrees Fahrenheit. Average. That's pretty cold. It's also the windiest continent on Earth. Those katabatic winds can blow for weeks at over 200 miles per hour. There's not much hope to survive in those winds unless you have enough food and a good shelter, and you can wait out those winds and not starve. It's very, very tough, those winds. A short science lesson. Why the South Pole is so cold, and why the winds there are so strong, strongest in the world. Some of the factors are elevation. The polar caps average nearly 10,000 feet above sea level, so they're way up high, so they've got gravity working here. And they're cold, so the air above them also becomes very, very cold. And then there's isolation. With no other land masses nearby to mix things up, the cold air just pools and pools and forms a giant dome over the South Pole. So this giant dome of very dense cold air up 10,000 feet above sea level. And then you've got the Earth's tilt, which helps to make it even colder, because during the winter it receives no sunlight, so it just gets colder and denser. And then you have the problem of the mountains, where they tend to block the air, the dome from coming down, and it can only go down the valleys. And since it's forced down the valleys, the funnel effect occurs, the Venturian effect, and the air accelerates very quickly down the mountains on its way to the ocean. You know, this air that was up 10,000 feet suddenly can move, and it does move, and that's what makes the katabatic winds. Antarctica is also considered the darkest continent because there's almost no human light there at all during the winter, and during the winter only the moon and stars for light. As far as we know, there's no indigenous people there, at least none that we've discovered, and almost no pollution, which is kind of cool. It has no official time, so normally countries that come there to do research, they'll set their clocks to whatever country they came from, and that's what they'll use for their time. There are no official countries there. The entire continent is dedicated to peace and to scientific research, and hopefully it'll stay that way after the next, when the treaty comes up for renewal in 2041. And also, of course, nearly no life there. And yet, within this inhospitable world, in the records of the rock and the ice, which has a neat way of capturing things, especially cosmic things, there may be some answers to the nature of how the universe began, and then more current answers in how climate change affects and what it will do when it happens. Interesting place. It has a lot to give to all of us and let us understand. In terms of exploration, as far as we know, the first person to go there was this sealer, person who hunts seals, John Davis, who was an American, who set foot there in 1821. And then 80 years later, the Norwegians and the British had a big race to the pole. They wanted to be the first to get to the South Pole. And this guy, Amundsen, Roald Amundsen, stoic, tough, strong guy, decided the way to get there was by speed and great endurance. He used dog sleds and packed it up with food and just went for it. As it turns out, his method was very successful. He managed to get there and to plant the Norwegian flag and get back, and luckily picked a good access place to make the trek, and everything worked for him. The British, this amazing man, Robert Scott, who was a scientist, an engineer, a writer, a Renaissance guy, who had been to Antarctica many times and learned so much about it and wrote about it, and we've learned a lot about it from him and all his expeditions. Mounted an incredible expedition to try to get to the South Pole with all these teams and plans for how they would drop the food, and they would go certain distances, and they had it all mapped out. And he did make it to the South Pole. The final team, there's a bunch of teams, they get less and less people as you get closer to the pole, but he did make it to the pole, but the Norwegian actually beat him. But then on his way back, the beast, the katabatic winds, unfortunately hit, and the crew was only a mile from a food reserve that would have saved them. but unfortunately the winds that just were so strong, they had to hole up in their tents and they didn't have enough food. And so ultimately what happened is they perished there. And but they left such a legacy of information that they were an incredible contribution to the world. After this, in 1915, there was this man, Ernest Shackleton, and his crew, which did an incredible adventure. Their goal was to walk across Antarctica on foot, which didn't really work out because when they came to Antarctica, they were trying to figure out the best route to walk across Antarctica, and they took a little too much time doing this. And when they finally found where they were going to go, it was fall and the ice started freezing, and early, unfortunately, and their ship actually got trapped in the ice, and then more specifically in the pack ice, and they couldn't get out. They tried all kinds of things, but the Weddell Sea eventually crushed their ship, and so they're forced to stay there. They couldn't really do anything, so they actually overwintered right on the ice pack for the whole winter, the dark, cold winters of Antarctica with the wind. And then when spring began, they dragged the rescue boats to the edge of the ice and managed to row across. And this was an incredible drag because they were going over pack ice and ridges, and super difficult place to try to get far enough out to get into the water was very difficult. But they did make it. Then they rowed across the rough seas of the South Sea to Elephant Island, where he left half the crew there to survive on their own, which they did by, these are very inhospitable island, windswept cliffs and rocky, but they hunted penguins and seals, and they used the seals' oil for cooking and for light and for heat. And they survived. And then, meanwhile, Shackleton retrofitted a lifeboat with a small sail, and with his incredible navigator, who was an expert at using the sextant for navigation, they were able to sail across 800 miles of the South Sea, which is some of the roughest sea, as I said, in the world, to the island of South George, which they hit, which is absolutely nearly miraculous. That's so hard to navigate like that. But unfortunately, when they knew that the other end of the island might have a whaling establishment, but they couldn't get around the island. Their boat was destroyed, and so they had to go by foot. And this island is not an easy one to walk across. It has the same problem. It has ice bridges over big crevices that you can't see. You fall through the snow. The snow's real deep. The mountains are super steep. When you're climbing, the snow can release and you get these bad avalanches, and just super hard. Even today, with the high-tech gear and everything, it is considered one of the most difficult things to do. And he did it faster than even the fast people today can do it, which is amazing. But anyways, in the end, he did make it to the whaling community, and they were rescued, and they even found the crew on Elephant Island and rescued them as well, and the entire crew survived, which is absolutely amazing. So they say if you want to get there, you go with Raoul. If you want to survive, you go with Ernest. Antarctica contains 70% of the Earth's fresh water and 90% of the Earth's ice. So if Antarctica melts, if our global warming continues, it's estimated the ocean will rise some 180 feet. And this is an animation of what will happen to the coast of the USA. You'll watch Florida disappear, and all the cities along the coast pretty much go underwater, and the continent of North America shrinks. There goes Florida. City, Boston, all go underwater. So it's going to be a different place. Okay. Some geology. Antarctica is covered by a mile-deep layer of ice and snow, which is 3 miles in some places. It has a mountain range underneath it called the Trans-Antarctic Mountains, which were once part of the Andes Mountains of South America. If you're going to walk across Antarctica, you should be very careful, because underneath the surface, the ice is moving. And as those lower layers of ice move, they create gigantic chasms and cracks in the ice. But then the wind on the surface, that katabatic winds, blow very hard, and they actually create these very thin ice bridges over these gigantic chasms. And if you're walking, you can't tell. You think it's just a nice white, solid ground, but actually you might be walking on one of these thin ice bridges that's going over a chasm that's like a mile deep. So as you walk over that chasm on that thin ice bridge, it breaks. And that's all she wrote for you or anybody who attempts that. So when we were in Antarctica, they had all kinds of devices for detecting what was right below the surface so that we wouldn't end up falling through one of these ice bridges. This guy, Andrei Kapitsa, this Russian man, first theorized and then actually found that there's a gigantic freshwater lake underneath Antarctica, larger than Lake Superior in the United States. It's a great lake. Unfortunately, it's under 2 miles, 2.5 miles, I think, of ice, so it's not an easy place to reach. But what's interesting about this is that this great lake has been shut off from the rest of the planet for 20 million years. And so as far as there could possibly be some kind of life form down there that we have no idea what it is, different from anything we know of. Hard part is exploring it, but we're working on that. We learned many types of ice while in Antarctica. There's names for all the different ices. There's fast ice, which connects the continent and freezes very quickly in the fall. Up to 10 kilometers per day it freezes out from the shores. This is the stuff the young penguins have troubles with, because they have to, when they reproduce, and then the babies, they have a very short time to grow up, so to speak. And when they're finally ready to be on their own, the water starts freezing, the fast ice starts freezing, and they've got to get out across the ice to the water and get in the water so that they can survive the winter underneath the ice where it's safe for them. So pretty tough, but they do it, most of them anyways, not all of them, of course. Then there's all these other ices. There's the pack ice that I mentioned. That's super hard for humans, very difficult to try to get across in any form that we have available to us, and especially with those giant pressure ridges when the pack ice collides, and not good. And then there's the signature beautiful, really beautiful blue ice that people love to see in Antarctica. And this is ice that's pretty cool. It's ice that the bubbles have been forced out of it. There's no air bubbles in it because of the pressure. This ice is formed down low in the layers of ice, and so the top layers crush it and force all the air bubbles out. And then when it gets exposed, due to the nature of light, and since there's no bubbles in there, it appears blue. It's absolutely gorgeous. Then there's grease ice, which is this thin, soupy, lumpy, clumpy, weird ice that we did see, which becomes shuga ice. There's growlers that ships hit sometimes because they don't see them, and they're pretty dangerous. They can cause a lot of damage because they're basically icebergs. Then there's tabular icebergs that are beautiful, and they break off from the shelf, and you can see the flat surface on them. Then there's bergy bits, there's brash ice, there's frazzle ice, there's gray ice, there's nylos, there's pancake, there's snow, there's young, and I think there's many more. there's a lot of types of ice there. And then there's the amazing South Sea, which the whole world depends on, and a lot of the world is not even that aware of. The South Sea completely encircles Antarctica, and because of the cold and the hot convergence, there's this incredible current that just circles around Antarctica, and this current is really large, 4 times the size of the Gulf Stream, with a volume of over 100 times that of all the surface rivers of the world put together. And that's pretty impressive. And also the highest density of life per inch occurs at the convergence of the cold fresh water that comes out of Antarctica as it interacts with the warm ocean waters of the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the South Atlantic Oceans. And this zone of convergence, divergence, is a mecca for living organisms, creates dense plumes of living organisms, which is why it's called the breadbasket of the earth. There's more creatures per square inch here than even at the equators. And this is why large animals like elephants, not elephants, like whales, feed in this zone. This is a short animation of some amazing, brave people going down one of these holes in Antarctica and going down through time, and you can see some of the formations that they see as they go down.
As they drop, they travel back in time. 30 meters down,
they're going back
and they reach
down
ice
time.
formed from snow that fell 10,000 years ago in the last ice age.
They're going back down before the ice age. They're way down there now. Why the sound didn't go? Oh, that's why. Under the ice is a whole nother story. This is a picture of looking up at the ice from the bottom. You can see that algae that I was talking about. And there's just all these plants. It's like this whole universe of life that we don't know so little. Plants and animals, things like jellyfish, king crabs, and then there's the krill, which is a really incredible little creature. If one were to weigh all the krill of the world, they would outweigh any other creature on the entire planet. So it's the one creature that has the greatest biomass in the world, and that's why so many creatures depend on krill, because it's at the bottom of the food chain, or lower on the food chain anyways. And then there's the Drake Shake. This is a pretty rough thing. When you cross from South America to Antarctica, you cross through Drake's Passage, and there's times of the year, normally like in their summer of Antarctica, normally the waves are a little bit smaller, but that didn't happen for us. We hit the Drake Shake when it was feeling rough, and we actually ran into waves that were 60 feet high. This is because if you see Antarctica, the winds go in one way, the westward flow. The eastward flow is this cold current that converges with this western wind flow that just goes right around Antarctica, and as those winds just keep going around Antarctica, the waves just get bigger and bigger and bigger. There's nothing to stop them from growing. And so we hit it at a bad time, and we hit these 60-foot waves, which were really amazing, but they were making everybody feel seasick. We were on a big boat. It's a gigantic ship that we're on there. Which moves like that is pretty amazing. This is the gigantic wave that we hit the biggest one.
It's a fucker!
And yeah, kind of the crew on the ship thought it was fun.
That's
We all thought it was cool, but we weren't feeling so good in general. But thanks to this drug here, phenogrin, that was a miracle drug for me. It really helped. And that's pretty much it for the education part of this. This artist, I did know her, I can't remember what her name is. I think she's actually from Cambridge, and she's very good at capturing the feel of Antarctica in her artwork. But when we finally did get to Antarctica, we had the views of a lifetime. We had unbelievably lucky weather, and we got all these gorgeous pictures. And I put them all together in a short slideshow, which is also on my YouTube channel if you want to watch just the movie. The movie's a lot shorter than this. The history thing here is a little bit longer, but if you want to see it, it is really beautiful. And thank you for listening to this.